Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. I would like to welcome you to this session. I'm Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, the Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's History Highlights program, Investigating Babyn Yar, with special guest author Dr. Martin Dean. I'd like to start this evening by extending a special thank you to our community partners for this program, Southwest Jewish Congress, Temple Shalom, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. Thank you all so much for your support of the museum. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our board members, museum members, and volunteers watching tonight, and a shout out also to some of our docents who have joined us. Your support helps us continue to offer programs like these. Tonight, we are really thrilled to have Dr. Martin Dean with us. Dr. Dean has worked as a researcher for the Special Investigations Unit in Sydney, Australia, and as the senior historian for the Metropolitan Police War Crimes Unit in London. While a research scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., he was a volume editor of the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. His publications include Collaboration in the Holocaust, Robbing the Jews, and most recently, Investigating Babyn Yar, Shadows from the Valley of Death. He currently works as a historical researcher for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center and as an adjunct professor teaching courses on the Holocaust and World War II at Kean University in Union, New Jersey. We will leave time at the end of the program for your questions and answers. Please use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions, and we will get to as many of those as we can. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Dean to share his presentation. Dr. Dean, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your kind introduction. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
It's not allowing me to go forward or backwards. Sure why. So today I will talk about my recently released book, Investigating Babyn Yar. I think that's it now. Can you see that?
Yes.
So this new book, it takes a look at photographic and eyewitness evidence to present a comprehensive analysis of the September 1941 massacre that comprised the largest mass shooting in history. The main reason for writing the book was that until recently, many details of what happened remained unexplained. It was to resolve some of these unknowns that I conducted a large-scale research project for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center starting in 2019. The Babyn Yar mass shooting took place soon after Himmler ordered the Nazi security police to expand the target of their operations to include Jewish women and children. It encompassed the destruction of the Jewish population of an entire city, Kyiv, comprising more than 33,000 people in just 2 days. Using photographs, witness testimonies, and aerial images, I will reconstruct the route taken by the Jews into the ravine and identify the location of the mass shootings. by following the discarded property and clothing of the Jews, captured in contemporary photographs. This leads us like a trail of breadcrumbs to the site where the massacre took place. We will also examine the responses of individual Jews along the route and discuss rare photographs of the victims. Finally, we will examine German efforts to destroy the mass graves, as well as the post-war Soviet effort to erase the landscape at Babyn Yar, which served to deny the victims their Jewish identity. The Einsatzgruppen were SS and police squads that followed the German army into the Soviet Union to deal with what Hitler called declared enemies. The mobile Einsatzgruppen were specially designed teams, about 3,000 strong in total, consisting of security police officers and men, guards from the Waffen-SS and the Order Police, and also police drivers and translators, all of whom participated in the shootings. The Einsatzgruppen were supported by police battalions, local auxiliaries, Waffen-SS units, and the German army. These killing squads kept detailed records of their mass shootings that added up to more than 1 million victims by the summer of 1942. Those shot are mostly described as Jews. By August 1941, mass shootings were an almost daily occurrence for members of the Einsatzgruppen. There are a complete set of Einsatzgruppen reports going up to the summer of 1942. Einsatzgruppen report number 106 from early October 1941 states that 33,771 Jews were shot at Babyn Yar near Kyiv on September the 20th, 29th to 30th, 1941. And as far as we know, this number is more or less accurate. Obviously, it's probably not down to the very last number, but intensive research has not shown any more reliable figures, and it seems to be roughly in the region of the number of people there at the time. Many other estimates were very similar. From the start, the Einsatzgruppen targeted the Jewish intelligentsia, but increasingly also Jewish men of military age between 18 and 45. From mid-August, the Einsatzgruppen started to expand the killings to include women and children. By September 1941, complete Jewish communities were to be exterminated in newly occupied towns and cities. The German security police used deception to facilitate their murderous plans. Following the mass shooting of more than 20,000 Jews in Kamianets-Podolsky in late August, Einsatzgruppe C then conducted mass shootings in Zhytomyr, Berdychev, and Vinnytsia in September 1941. On September the 19th, the German army entered Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, after a prolonged battle in which the city became encircled. These battles north of Kyiv bought time for the Soviets to evacuate industrial workers, some industry, and government officials out of the city by rail. Among them were large numbers of Jews. Probably more than 100,000 Jews managed to evacuate, leaving around 50,000 people behind. The evacuation of industry was a major accomplishment, which enabled factories to resume production further east. But Jews were not given priority in the evacuations. However, many of them were saved from Kyiv. Conditions for the evacuees were very harsh. For example, as a railroad employee, Führer Schwarz's father was evacuated with his family in July 1941. Führer recalled, "We only took the most necessary clothing, my toys and children's books, my bed linen, and a few pots." They were evacuated to Magnitogorsk, but soon her father was called up to the Red Army and killed at the front. I quote Führer, "My mother and I were starving and freezing because we didn't have any winter clothes. In early 1943, Führer's mother died of pneumonia. Her grandfather remained behind in Kyiv and was killed at Babyn Yar. As a result of the war, Führer became an orphan." Some Jews, such as Sarah Schulman, were sent soon after the German invasion to dig trenches nearby. As she explained, "I was a Soviet person, they told us to go, and so we went." Later, she was evacuated to Central Asia. She went on a freight train. The trip lasted for over a month, and we arrived in Uzbekistan, 3,000 kilometers from Kyiv. We rented a hut from an Uzbek man who allowed us to pick tomatoes from his garden. The local population was friendly, and we didn't face any anti-Semitism. On returning to Kyiv in 1944, she learned that her grandparents had been killed at Babyn Yar. And in the book, I also discuss some of the experiences Jews made on returning to Kyiv after the occupation. German forces arrived in Kyiv on September the 19th, and 5 days later, on September 24th, several large explosions wrecked buildings used by the German military administration along Kyiv's main street, Khreshchatyk. They were caused by mines set off remotely by Soviet security service, killing dozens of people. The resulting fires burned for a week, which together with German containment measures caused widespread damage in the city. Thousands of people were made homeless. On September the 25th to 27th, the SS and Wehrmacht commanders held meetings in Kyiv. They decided to murder the city's Jews as a reprisal for the recent explosions. Placards calling on all Jews to present themselves at a specific road junction near Babyn Yar were posted around the city by the Ukrainian police on September the 28th. They were instructed to bring with them documents, money, and valuables, as well as warm clothing and bedding. The threatened punishment for non-compliance was death. So Jews speculated as to what this all might mean. Some feared the worst, but most expected that there would be some form of resettlement into a ghetto or labor camp. They were used to obeying such arbitrary orders under the Soviet government. Jewish teenager Vera Bogutska, for example, noted, "Most people were of the opinion that we would be sent away to work. My mother packed up our things. I saw that the streets were full of people carrying luggage. Some of them had carts. They were all going in one direction. Towards evening, my mother and I left our apartment with our luggage. We went down several streets with many other people. The collection point was near the Jewish burial grounds. In response to the placards, more than 20,000 Jews took to the streets of Kyiv on September 29th. This photograph, taken by a German in Kyiv at the time, is inscribed on the back, "Jews taking their last journey on earth." These images were collected by the Babyn Yar Society in Kyiv. So I use the term Babyn Yar as that's the Ukrainian spelling, but obviously most people know it from the Russian spelling Babyn Yar, but these days it's generally not used, particularly in Ukraine. And obviously when I was working for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, then I used that spelling. Those killed were mainly women and children and the elderly, as most of the men of working age had joined the Red Army or had been evacuated by the Soviet authorities as useful workers. So as they walked out of the city, eventually the Jews carrying their luggage came to the first checkpoint, which is described vividly by Jewish survivor Genia Batasheva and other witnesses. It was the place where non-Jews accompanying friends and relatives had to turn back. Vehicles could go no further. And the Jews had to continue on foot with only what they could carry. From here on, the Jews were more closely guarded with little chance of escape. According to Batasheva, so we walked a short distance past Pugachev Street, and there on both sides stood anti-tank hedgehogs with a passageway down the middle. We could walk to this passageway, we could still move toward these anti-tank hedgehogs, we could turn around, and a lot of things were already scattered next to these anti-tank hedgehogs. Farther on, there was nothing, but right in front of this, people were already throwing down such heavy portable things. In this rare photograph from a private collection, a column of Jews can be seen walking down the street while German policemen question them and instruct them to deposit their belongings. Leonid Pushta, a driver for Sonderkommando 4A, recalled this scene. I drove out of Kyiv and came to an LA. there was a checkpoint which let me through. I saw that along this alley, Jews were marching. They were going in groups as if for a stroll. On the left lay an enormous pile of luggage, which was about 3 meters by 2 meters. It looked like a huge pile of potatoes. The Jews threw their luggage onto this pile. At the end of the alley, right, there was an open area where the registration took place. In this image taken just past the tree-lined alley, which you can see in the background, German policemen are patting down Jewish women and children, forcing them to hand over their documentation. Strewn haphazardly on the ground are piles of papers and personal possessions. After this humiliation, the Jews were formed into groups for the next stage of the journey. Some were transported by truck, and others marched on foot through a brutal narrow corridor of guards and into the sand quarry. This is a view of the alley of trees from above, taken in 1943. The Jews will have been walking down the alley here, probably on this right-hand side, and would have to deposit their luggage on the left. And then as they come further along here, they went up onto the right, and in this area, they start to have their possessions taken away, and a form of registration took place. I don't think they actually counted the people there. I think it was just really to identify them as Jews, although I don't know of any people being sent back at this point. And they still had some possessions after that, but only really the clothing was taken all the way to the sand quarry. In addition to the images collected by the Babyn Yar Society from relatives, Ellen Schindelman-Kovit passed on this photograph of her relative Srulik Schindelman, who was recognized by his relative Yakov Karpa in the Kerosina Street POW camp in Kyiv in late September of 1941. So he was probably captured as a POW and taken there, as was Karpa. And from there, he was most likely taken to be shot in the vicinity of Babyn Yar, along with hundreds of other Jews kept at the camp. He was never seen again. Karpa, who recognized him, managed to jump off one of the trucks headed for Babyn Yar, and was actually one of the prisoners who later escaped from the exhumation squad I'll talk about later in Babyn Yar. The question is often asked why Jews didn't do more to resist. It must be stressed that the vast majority of Jews in Kyiv at the time were women, children, and the elderly. Most men of military age had been conscripted or evacuated. Then there was the deception practiced by the Germans, which concealed the real aim of the order for the Jews to assemble. Many Jews thought they would be transported via the freight railway station close to the cemeteries. As a result, most Jews recognized their fate only too late, when they turned away from the railroad station and began to hear shots. By then, there was almost no chance of escape. Nonetheless, there were quite a few miraculous escapes. Reuven Stein, who at the time was a Jewish teenager, later on recalled, "From the first steps of our journey, I began to look for a possibility to escape from the column, but how and in what manner? The column was escorted by armed Nazis, and when there was only 250 to 300 meters remaining to Babyn Yar, one could hear screams and shots. I jumped unnoticed out of the column into the ditch alongside the road and crawled into a drainage ditch that ran under the street and sat there until it became dark. When the columns were not coming past so frequently, I climbed out on the other side of the street and went through the old cemetery and through the vegetable gardens to the edge of the city. In the night, I then made my way home." Here you see more or less the complete route. This is the main street, Melnikov, coming out of Kyiv, and then it bends a little to the left, and it gets to the Jewish cemetery. Is this area here? This is actually the main building of the Jewish cemetery, which is one of the few buildings that still exist today, so you can orientate yourself a little. But they didn't actually go past that building. They turned left here down Kahatna Street, most of them. Later on, some of them did go through this compound, and then they turned right here. You can't quite see it here, but the freight rail station is here, just behind this other cemetery. And once they turned away from it, this was much more alarming for the Jews. This is where the luggage in the LA was. And then they went along here and then probably turned right either into Babyn Yar or possibly along the top and then into it further down. And they come and then into this sand quarry here, which is what you see in some of the photographs, but was not really identified by other historians. And I was able to use aerial photography to locate it very effectively. And then the main shooting took place here in what I describe as the western spur of Babyn Yar. This is the main ravine where for a long time many people thought the shootings took place. It doesn't seem to make much sense, as they would then have to go back from the sand quarry into this area. And as there was a constant flow of people coming, it's more likely that they were taken to this further ravine, which also concealed the noise as it was had quite high walls. This is the Siretz camp, which wasn't built till 1942, and this photograph was actually taken in 1943. Some of these buildings you see here were used to keep some Jews overnight, as they weren't able to deal with all the people that arrived on the first day. So the shootings went on for 2 days altogether, although almost twice as many were shot on the first day as the second day. According to survivor Yevgeny Yekel, from Melikov Street, the flow of citizens headed left towards Dorozhitska Street, and then along this street toward the end of Lukyanovsky and military cemeteries, and then to the right along the natural boundary of Babyn Yar. At this point, the Nazis stood in 2 rows tightly next to each other and created a living corridor along which they drove the people doomed to death in a continuous stream. This is Yekel speaking. In this area, I stayed with my father. Now, I do not remember exactly where, but at one point there were many small ravines, and here the guards were standing farther apart. Seeing this, my father pushed me into one of the ravines, and he followed me. We went out of the ravine to the cemetery, where we waited until late at night, and then left for my father's house. The main clues we have about the route of the Jews after this are a series of photographs taken shortly after the massacre by the German propaganda photographer Johannes Hehler. And these were only discovered in the 1990s or so. The Hehler photographs show vast piles of clothing in what looks like a sand quarry, and also Soviet POWs covering over the ground in a long, steep-sided ravine. But where were these photographs taken? For many years, this remained a mystery to historians because the ravine landscape was changed so severely by the Soviets after the war. To correctly identify the shooting ravine with the POWs, I used the lone tree on the skyline as a reference point. Here we see the tree clearly visible on the skyline in 1946 during the visit of Mayor LaGuardia from New York. The tree was visible in the 1946 photograph, but could not be seen on the key Hehler photograph. But although the same crescent-shaped cliff is visible in the distance, it does not appear that we can see the tree. However, if you enlarge it and look particularly at this area, you see that there is the tree, but it's not against the skyline anymore. And it's concealed from a distance by the stand of trees behind it. So it's obviously looking at the tree from a different angle than the first photograph I showed you. Literally, you cannot see the tree for the woods. This confirms that the Hehler ravine is different from the main ravine, as it has quite a different angle on the lone tree, as can be seen by the contrasting backgrounds. By using aerial photography, we were then able to pinpoint where Hehler was standing on the road at the end of the western spur, close to where the Siretz camp was later built. By enlarging the aerial photo, we were able to identify the sand quarry, which lies between the 2 branches of Babyn Yar, close to where they meet. Its location was difficult to ascertain, as it is missing from most maps, as the sand quarry itself was only created in the late 1930s, as they began extracting sand from that area, and it disappeared again with changes in the landscape after 1950. The shifting sands of Babyn Yar have sown confusion that confounded historians for many years. Most of the Jews were forced to undress in the sand quarry. This is confirmed both by witness statements and also by the Hailer photographs. This overhead reconstructed view enables us to determine the position of the discarded clothing from the Hailer photographs. It indicates that the bulk of the Jews walked around towards the left along this route, probably towards this gap here. It may be that they actually climbed up the face here and along this way. It's possible there were other routes into what was then the shooting ravine here through this gap, and maybe some coming this way as well. And once in the sand quarry, the Jews were then driven into the left corner to enter the western spur up a slope and through a specifically created passageway, the Notch. Albin Pover, a German policeman present in the sand quarry during the shootings, testified, in the ensuing hollow, there were throngs of assembled Jews. The Jews had to undress at the end of the quarry, when partly naked, partly in their underclothes, over a steep slope, and disappeared into the adjacent valley or behind a mountain slope. From there, one could hear shooting. This map shows the likely location of the mass shootings in the Western Spur. As many as 3 or 4 separate shooting squads were operating along the length of this branch of the ravine, so probably more than 100 men altogether. And they also took it in turns to do the actual shooting, others reloading the bullets on the side of the ravine. The sand quarry was located in this section between the main ravine and the Western Spur. So here, again, it's not shown properly on this map. As this actually shows the later development. So unfortunately, there are 1 or 2 buildings now more or less on the site of this Western Spur, as well as a road that crosses it. Hailer was standing at the end of the Western Spur, looking straight down the length of the sand quarry. That's right, of the Western Spur. Here's the sand quarry on the right from this perspective. And the POWs were working here on the bottom, flattening it out. What actually happened is they blew up the sides of the ravine on the night after the second day of the shooting. And there's only one witness that confirms that, but many other people said they heard about it. And obviously the photographs seem to confirm it, as they show not only POWs flattening out the earth, but also some of the sides of the ravine are much steeper than would normally be the case in a ravine, and it looks like some kind of explosion has taken place. Also, a 3D model was created before and after, and that shows again that the sides of the ravine were quite different after 1941 than they had been before. Here you see the Hailer image again. So particularly on this side, these are not the natural sides of a ravine, you can see. And here there's also, looks like fresh earth has been revealed compared to the grayer sides elsewhere. And probably the whole length of this ravine, what you can see here at least, was used for the shooting. And there was later the site of exhumations as well. This image also matches a description by a German driver, Victor Trill, who stood more or less at the same point and during the actual shooting for a short time. And he said, looking from the bridge, which is what he calls this road here going across the end of the ravine, the depression made a turn to the right, where behind this curve, a large round depression in the ground was located. And here you can just see the top of what I call the sand quarry. And Jews literally had to come up a slope and through this notch and then into the shooting area down here. Still quoting Victor Trill, it is possible that this comprised a former sand or gravel pit In this pit, there were also countless people, this is during the shooting, who I can safely assume were all Jews. Also in this pit were mountains of clothing of all sorts. So we assume that most Jews entered through the notch, although it probably wasn't as pronounced as this image from 1943, but it was probably created just before the shooting, maybe to facilitate it. And a few Jews may have descended also into the main ravine and entered the western spur around here. One witness says that standing around here, he could see a pool of blood at this point, but that would probably be from all the shootings in this part. It seems to me unlikely. It's possible they use this area, but there are no witness descriptions that confirm that. The person who said that he saw the blood, he thought he might have heard shootings from there, but it may have just been the echoes. He couldn't actually see into this area. Essentially, 3 or 4 German shooting squads were spread along the length of the western spur and shot the Jews from close range using machine pistols as they were forced to lie down along the bottom of the ravine. So this is a German record from Kyiv dated the 10th of October 1941, which I found in Berlin. It had been in East Berlin until around 1990 and then was handed over to the West German Bundesarchiv. It's an original document sent by Sonderkommando 4A from Kyiv, and it lists hundreds of items of jewelry that were collected from Jews as they took their last steps into the ravine at Babyn Yar. The list includes 63 ladies' watches, more than 300 rings, and 95 decorative chains, weighing in total more than 2.5 kilograms. This was likely only a fraction of the total collected there. There were different units, not only the Sonderkommando 4A, involved in collecting the valuables, and many may also have been stolen. Here you see SS men rummaging through Jewish clothing at Babyn Yar. Essentially, they were searching for hidden valuables in the discarded clothing. And actually, by analyzing the witness testimonies, as hundreds of German policemen and SS men were asked about what happened, many could not remember very much, but if you piece them all together, a few do give some useful descriptions. And one detail that came out was that initially they weren't, they were being asked to surrender their valuables along the way, but this was slowing things down considerably. So they decided in the end to get everyone to take clothes off and then to search the clothing later for any concealed valuables as much as anything else, although the clothing itself was later distributed to the local population as well, mainly to ethnic Germans. This is a close-up of one of the Hailer photographs, and it even captures a photograph of a loved one lying in the sand, probably a victim. And we don't know the motives for Hailer to take these photographs, but these are not the regular propaganda photographs he would normally be taking. He was just on his day off and exploring the area around Kyiv. And so he probably wanted to document what happened. And for that reason, we have these important photographs that help us to reconstruct part of the story and help to explain what happened. So this is the famous aerial view that some people are more familiar with of Babyn Yar, and also the Siritz camp. This is the Siritz camp here. These are actually dugouts. And this was the area where the shooting took place. This thing here, which is not in the Hailer photograph, is probably a kind of drainage block that they put on to stop corpses washing down through the ravine. This is described by one SS officer, so these are the sort of pieces of evidence we've been using. And here you can see the sand quarry later became also a prison camp, as I'll discuss in a minute, during the exhumation of the bodies from Babyn Yar. The Siritz camp became a major torture center where hundreds of inmates died or were killed. And in August and September of 1943, some of the prisoners, including many Jews, were used to burn the corpses and cover the traces of German mass killings at Babyn Yar. Effectively, the Russians had exposed some of the mass graves further east, and so the SS set out on a large operation known as Special Operation 1005, and actually Paul Blobel was assigned to head this operation, and he was this was the same man that had organized the massacre of the Jews at Babyn Yar, and he not only conducted exhumations here, but organized literally hundreds of exhumations at sites all over Eastern Europe. Not all of them were completed, but in fact, most of the main mass graves were exhumed in places like Nikolaev and Minsk and Riga. They tried everywhere to destroy the evidence, but of course time was running out for them. And the reason we know about this, particularly in Kyiv, is around 15 prisoners managed to escape from the 300 prisoners used to exhume and burn corpses. And those prisoners later on pointed out where they were doing the exhumations, although there were several sites scattered around Babyn Yar, because there were many mass killings took place after the massacre of September 29th to 30th. So not all of the graves are exactly known, but this one is fairly certain. Here you see the bunker in which the prisoners were kept, and this is actually the shadow of a guard tower. And when the prisoners escaped from the main bunker, they managed to escape in the middle of the night, because among the corpses, they searched for any keys that had been in the pockets or were held by people who'd been shot. And they eventually found a key that matched the padlock that was on the iron gate to the bunker. And so in the middle of the night, they also broke their shackles using equipment they had managed to steal, and burst out of the front of the bunker. But they experienced machine gun fire from this tower. But then fairly shortly, the machine gun jammed, and this allowed 30 or more prisoners to escape and mostly run down Babyn Yar to the north. Some also went back towards the Sirets camp, which was probably not such a good route, but a couple of those did survive as well. And in total, 15 of the escapees managed to survive, but the rest of the men who were captured or didn't manage to break out of the bunkers were shot the following day, as was intended by the Germans. That's the reason for the escape. They heard that they were going to be shot the next day and broke out. And this photograph was taken literally one day before the escape. So it's really a document of importance for that reason as well. In this photo, a survivor of the exhumation squad points to where the corpses were exhumed in the western spur of the ravine. The hill with the lone tree can be seen in the background, although it may be blocked on my own version of this. All the evidence points to this as having been the location of the mass shooting. Of course, the bodies are gone because of the Nazi exhumations and cover-up, but local people also noticed the smoke and the smell during the burning of the remains. So I'll just talk very briefly about the post-war period. Yevgeny Yevtushenko wrote his famous poem Babyn Yar after visiting Kyiv in August 1961. The opening line, "No monument stands over Babyn Yar," was an indictment of Soviet suppression of information about the Holocaust. The poem became a rallying cry for Jews and others who gathered regularly at Babyn Yar for commemorations, despite strong discouragement by the Soviet authorities. A Soviet memorial was eventually completed in 1976, but it referred to the victims only as peaceful Soviet citizens, continuing the Soviet policy of concealing the Holocaust. This was the main memorial when I visited Kyiv in 2017. And now a number of additional sites have been added, including several artworks and also viewing stones of some of the Halo photographs. So placed at the exact sites where he stood when he took the pictures. So you can literally look into the stone and you see the photograph. And that would be what you would have seen if you were standing there on the day Haley was there, the day after the massacre. Here you see President Zelensky looking through one of the viewing stones in more peaceful times. shortly before the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022. During the 80th anniversary commemoration I attended, the first playing of Shostakovich's Babyn Yar, a musical score at the site, and speeches by President Zelensky, as well as Germany and Israel's presidents. There has been one other beautiful addition. On the initiative of the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, a painted wooden synagogue was installed at Babyn Yar in 2021, which has become an important cultural center for Kyiv's Jews and is viewed as an appropriate response and memorial close to the site of Babyn Yar. To conclude, I'll just explain a little bit more about my book. This is kind of the main framework of it I've gone over tonight, but it's actually constructed in about 26 separate chapters, each dealing with a main theme, and not necessarily in chronological order, but sort of telling the story a bit more how I discovered it myself, and sort of going backwards and forwards to cover important events, to sort of break up the pattern a bit, as just focusing on the massacre itself is, of course, very hard work for the reader. So I do break it up in that way. Among the themes I look at include obviously flight from Kyiv, and also escapes by Jews along the route, Germans escalating their killing procedures on the way to Kyiv. I do go into the exhumations in quite a bit of detail, and also the changes in the landscape at Babyn Yar after the war. There was also a terrible mudslide catastrophe in the early 1960s, which actually happened further down Babyn Yar, but it's not completely unrelated to the massacre, as one of the aims of the Soviet authorities was to sort of fill up the ravine so that it would no longer be a kind of place of memorial. I also discuss war crimes trials and the eventual retreat of the Germans, some of the memorials that were put up in Babyn Yar, and also, as we saw, details about the sand quarry, the alley of trees, what was done with Jewish property, and even the Jewish cemetery plays quite a large role. For some time, people thought that the Jews had actually gone through the Jewish cemetery, but they passed along outside it, but then turned it off in the other direction. But nevertheless, during the exhumations, some tombstones from the Jewish cemetery were taken to provide a basis for burning the corpses. So it's possible that there may be some Jewish tombstones that have been broken up still in the ground somewhere, although it's likely they were probably removed when the whole area was dug up again after the war. My main focus on the book is to describe the events through numerous witness testimonies. So I used the German war crimes trials and many other survivor testimonies, and also some even KGB investigations. And initially I thought these testimonies would not tell me very much, but the more you put them together, and especially when you can start to put them into the geography, then they do make sense, and they tell quite a coherent, if very frightful story. And one of the things that is most tragic is how the Jews themselves describe going along this route, the few that managed to survive. Some did also escape from the mass grave, so they literally went through the whole process, but their testimonies are particularly horrifying about how they gradually realized what was going to happen to them. I don't discuss collaboration so much in this book, because I have written about that before. And in Kyiv, because they arrived very shortly before the mass shootings, only a few collaborators were involved, although they did play quite a vicious role in forcing the Jews to undress. But they mostly were not involved directly in shooting people. But obviously, in many other parts of Ukraine, there was widespread participation by the local police, especially in the ghetto liquidations in 1942. Just briefly, the project I was working on as I started this book, this was linked also to a large 3D model that was being prepared close to the site, where people could go in and explore what the landscape had really looked like, both before, during, and after the massacre. And I worked together with a 3D modeler, who was doing some fantastic work. But unfortunately, due to the Russian invasion, that whole plan was literally put on hold and has probably lost the funding that it needed at that time. But I think eventually, when the war is over and things improve in Kyiv, then they will get back to some of these projects and complete and what was being done. But it was important for me to write this book, really, to make sure that the work that I did is documented and is available to people later on. So thank you very much for listening to my story.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. That was very horrifying, fascinating, and enlightening, all rolled into one. We have several questions that have come through from people who are part of this webinar. So let's get to them. The first question is, what day or days were the hail photos taken? And as part of that, were they published or were they later recovered, and how did scholars become aware of them?
Those are very good questions. As far as we know, this must have been taken really the day after, or possibly 2 days after, so either 1st or 2nd of October. We definitely know that Hala was in Kyiv in early October, but we don't have a precise date for the photographs, although there was snow by about the 8th or 10th of October, so it's clearly before that. And just from what you see there, it can only be 1 or 2 days after the mass shooting. I think the effort here is to cover over the mass graves. The story of the photographs is quite interesting. I mean, people were aware of them a little bit in the 1950s and 60s, where I think they were part of a war crimes investigation at some stage. But actually, a scholar I know quite well, Peter Klein, eventually made them available through the Hamburger Institute for Social Research as part of the Wehrmacht exhibition. He was able to locate these photos, and they're now ready, available for anyone who wants to use them. So I had no problems with copyright or anything for these photographs. And even so, it was not known exactly where they were taken, although some scholars had different views up until I worked on this in 2017. In fact, locating this photograph where it was taken was the main aim of the research project started by Carol Berkoff, which I worked on. Unfortunately, Carol left the project for various reasons before it was completed, but I definitely owe a lot to his inspiration in putting this together, and especially the idea of using aerial photography together with the ground photography was a very successful approach, which I can highly recommend.
Okay, thank you. This person would like to know what happened to the personal effects left in the ravine. So clearly from the photos, we know that Germans, and I'm assuming Ukrainians as well, searched through them for valuables, those kinds of things. But was there any attempt to document or recover any of these personal effects at any point?
Right. So the clothing, definitely we know quite a lot about. Several witnesses describe driving up to the sand quarry and taking them back into the city. I think they were put in a church or some other building like that. And there's even a man who was appointed, an ethnic German from Ukraine, who was given the job of looking after the clothing and distributing it to either ethnic Germans or Ukrainians. And this is very much what happened with property from nearly all of the mass shootings, that people were forced to undress beforehand. The property was recovered. It was searched for valuables. So the report I found in Berlin was one of literally dozens of similar reports, some by the army, some by police battalions, and some by the Einsatzgruppen of property they recovered and handed back to the German War Booty office. So there was a whole industry sort of processing any valuables from these mass shootings as well.
Okay. This person would like to know what happened to the perpetrators of Babyn Yar, and do you know if any of them were actually tried for this particular event or for other events in which they took part?
Right. Well, that's a good question, because the two main perpetrators, both Paul Blobel and Jekyll, Friedrich Jekyll, were both tried, Jekyll by the Soviets, Blobel at Nuremberg, and they were both hanged. So there was a little bit of justice done there. There was a big investigation in Germany into Sonderkommando 4A, which was mainly responsible as the part of Einsatzgruppe C, which organized and conducted the mass shooting. But very few sentences came out of that. 3 or 4 people got sentences of sort of 5 to 15 years, but most people got away with it, which is pretty outrageous. Actually, only 2 or 3 years ago, I was still working together with Ephraim Zurov and other people to try and get the Germans to reopen these cases, as they were still reopening some concentration camp cases. But somehow the German law didn't really extend to people who hadn't committed crimes either with excessive force or with anti-Semitic intent. And because you have to prove the intent, most of the foot soldiers got away with it. In fact, reading some of the many interrogations around this Sonderkommando 4A case, some of the lower ranking people, including the drivers, were more or less told that if you tell the truth, then nothing will happen to you. And that's partly why the testimonies I have are fairly forthcoming and do give quite detailed descriptions, that they more or less knew that they weren't going to be punished for it, which is it's not justice in my view. Someone who shot literally hundreds of people, the ones who refused, they weren't shot themselves. They might be transferred to another unit and put to the front. And there were actually some very young Waffen-SS men who took part in the shootings. And these men were then transferred to the front anyway a few weeks later. So we do know quite a lot about the perpetrators. Very few of them were tried, not more than probably 10 or 20 altogether. I mean, some of them were tried for other crimes, that was the case with Blobel and Jekyll, that their trials were for other mass crimes they committed in Riga, particularly in Jekyll's case. Blobel was literally all over the place, so there were many things he could be tried for, and he did at least get hanged.
The next question, this is a two-part question. The first part is, when did the rest of the world learn about what had happened at Babyn Yar? And I'm assuming that it wasn't a one-off, that there were multiple kind of focuses on it. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part is, other than just the sheer number of victims over the course of this brief period, what makes Babyn Yar unique? I mean, there are other mass shooting locations, so why is this particular location one that has been focused upon?
So those are good questions. And the news about the mass shooting did get out, of course, and there were reports in places like Switzerland and Sweden, and obviously among the German army, people were speaking very openly about the scale of it. The Soviets also got wind of it fairly quickly. People in Kyiv knew about it immediately. It didn't get too much widespread reportage really in the West during the war, even though we had at a very early stage some police reports that had been transcribed from intercepted radio messages. I don't think they actually got the one about Babyn Yar, but they heard about many other Einsatzgruppen killings. But Churchill didn't want to reveal his knowledge of the German decrypt, so he was kind of reluctant to give too much information away straight away. But the highest levels people were aware, although not so specifically about Babyn Yar. But there were also published reports, and certainly you can even read something about it in things like the Polish Underground or the Yiddish press in America, and knew about a large-scale killing in Kyiv, certainly by 1942 or 1943. So, but it doesn't become more famous until obviously Kuznetsov's book is probably the most important event, even though he doesn't go into anything like the detail I have done about the killing itself. But it is still an amazing book with much information that I found absolutely vital. And it sort of, he was a local historian who went around talking to people and just found there was this huge elephant in the room that the government was not being honest about. And so his book was perhaps most important. And that does, together with things like the demonstrations in Kyiv in the 1960s, to commemorate it, where Jews were already then fighting for the the right to have a proper memorial. It became really symbolic for what's now known as the Shoah by bullets. It is actually in many ways different from other, certainly it's different from the ghetto liquidations, which was the case for much of Western Ukraine and places like Belarus and Lithuania. Here, they literally took all the Jews from a city, marched them out to a ravine, and shot them in 2 days. Generally, the process took much longer, with ghettos being created, and there would even be separate waves of killings. Even some of the places in Russia, there would be sort of 2 or 3 waves. So this was sort of one very intense effort. And I think the problem was that once they started doing this, then people got wind of it. So in Kyiv, people were not expecting this to happen. So that's why it was pretty effective from the German point of view, but it's not something they could just repeat and repeat. Just before this, there was a very big killing at Kamianets-Podolsky and other mass shootings of almost the same scale. Riga was a similar one in December 1941, also in Lithuania. So that there were other killings of almost the same scale, but somehow this was the most rapid and sort of, in some ways, efficient. And in my analysis of the killing, in some ways, there's a little bit of what you see in the extermination centers here, that they're being depersonalized along the route, and what happens to German Jews over 10 years happens to them in Kyiv in just 2 days. That everything is done, their property is taken, they're dehumanized, and then they're shot. All in a very short period. So I think it's this intenseness and massive scale, and it is still probably the largest mass shooting in history, in the sense that the people shot were completely defenseless, which in most cases just doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you. A couple of additional questions. This person would like to know, how many Jewish survivors of Babyn Yar can we account for?
That's a good question. I know it's probably more than 30, although of course many of them have since passed away. There's not an official total that I can give. Obviously, some are in different categories. So there are people who didn't go to Babyn Yar, and more of those probably survived than the ones that did, obviously, although they still had to survive the whole war. And then some kind of fled on the way there. Others crawled out of the mass graves, but it's definitely more than 30, but probably not more than 100, I would say. It's very hard to estimate exactly. There were even some non-Jews shot there who got caught up in the, who went along with Jews, many half-Jews, of course, and some people did manage to escape by persuading guards that they were not Jewish. That number was very small, and some of those were half Jewish. So it's almost impossible to give a precise number. I have about 20 to 30 cases that I've documented. There are definitely more, but probably not many more. I think I've got probably at least about half of the ones that are known.
Okay. Final question. Is the memorial and synagogue still intact that you showed in your slide presentation, given what's going on currently in Ukraine?
I think it's intact, but it's probably not used very often because of the danger to it. There was quite a big investigation because they did fire rockets at the television tower, which is very close
that. Yeah,
to the old Soviet memorial, and to the site of other things in Babyn Yar. In fact, one of the buildings used by the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center was also hit, although nobody was killed in that particular building, although other people were killed at the television tower. That was not obviously directly intended against Babyn Yar. It was intended against the TV tower, although it does show the Russian complete disregard for human life or any sort of values in the way they did that. But none of the new memorials created by the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center were damaged by that attack, other than the building they were planning to use for one of their museums. Nevertheless, it was very close to certainly where the old memorial was, and also where the Jewish cemetery was. So in that sense, it was an attack on Babyn Yar.
Dr. Dean, thank you so very much for joining us this evening and for sharing the research that you did into investigating Babyn Yar, your book. Also, thank you all for having joined us to hear Dr. Dean's remarks. For those of you who are members of the museum and do use our library collection, we will be adding a copy of Dr. Dean's volume to our library, so you will certainly be able to read it there as well. And I'd like to wish everybody a good evening and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.